She had never spoken those words to anyone before. He had never been asked for anything so impossible. And in the frozen silence between them, the wind itself seemed to wait. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from. The first time the shy traveler saw her, he thought she was part of the landscape, an impossible silhouette carved from the blinding whiteness of the tundra, standing as if the wind itself obeyed her presence. He had been walking for hours through a corridor of ice ridges that rose like broken cathedral walls, exhausted, dehydrated, and trembling with the ache that had been living inside his ribs since the winter took his father. The storm was loosening, but the cold still pressed against him with the weight of something ancient, something old enough to have forgotten the world of men. When she stepped forward, shedding snow from her hair like frost shaken from pine branches, he felt his breath tighten, not from fear, not exactly, but from the strange recognition of someone who belonged so deeply to the land that she seemed older than the land itself. He lowered his gaze out of instinct, as if approaching a sacred place, not because she demanded it, but because her stillness carried the authority of winter. She did not speak, not yet. Her boots carved precise, silent compressions in the snow as she circled him once, examining him with the poise of a hunter evaluating a wounded animal that might or might not survive the night. The traveler felt the heat of embarrassment rising under his frozen skin, uncertain whether he should bow, look up, or try to explain how he had come to be alone in this white nowhere. His gloves were torn, exposing bruised knuckles to the cold, and his breath left his mouth in uneven plumes that betrayed how close he was to collapsing. The woman stopped directly in front of him, her expression unreadable beneath the faint shimmer of snowflakes clinging to her lashes, and he sensed without any spoken word that she was deciding whether to help him or let the ice claim one more wandering soul. When she finally reached out, touching only the air between them, he felt warmth behind him, as if an unseen shelter had opened. She led him not with orders but with quiet movements, her pace steady and deliberate, never looking back to check if he followed because she already knew he would. The wind changed direction as they walked, no longer cutting at his cheeks but gliding past them as though parting to make room for her. At first, he thought the shift was simply luck, the fading of the storm. But then he noticed how the air softened around her shoulders, how the drifting snowflakes seemed to hesitate before landing on her coat, as if reconsidering. She walked with the kind of grace that came from belonging completely to a hostile world, someone who had learned not to resist the cold but to listen to it. He stumbled behind her, boots sinking deeper than hers, legs shaking, but she never slowed, trusting that he would keep up until they reached a hollow in the ice shaped like a natural alcove. Inside it, the wind quieted to a hush. The space she brought him to was not a home, not even a shelter built by human hands, but a pocket of stillness carved by time and frozen pressure. The snow inside was smooth, untouched, reflecting the faint blue glow that seeped through the ice above them. She placed her spear against the wall and then kneeled, striking two pieces of dark stone together until a small spark kissed a bundle of dry moss she carried in a pouch at her hip. The flame crawled alive with slow patience, and she coaxed it without hurry, her breath steady, as though the fire recognized her voice even when she didn't speak. The traveler watched her hands with fascination. They moved with confidence but also restraint, every gesture measured, as if she feared waking something in the ice. When the fire grew enough to cast a small warmth into the hollow, she finally looked at him and motioned for him to sit. He lowered himself awkwardly, his legs barely supporting him, and extended his trembling hands toward the heat. The sensation was almost painful at first, the returning blood stinging beneath his skin, the ache of life forcing itself back into his fingers. He exhaled shakily, relishing the relief, but he kept his eyes lowered, aware of her watching him with an expression that was not curiosity, nor judgment, but something closer to assessment. She seemed to be reading the weight he carried, tracing the invisible burden across his posture, the kind that came not from the cold outside but from the cold buried inside a person. He could almost feel her noticing the hollow behind his ribs where grief had carved space, the way he held his breath when memories pulled at him, the way his shoulders had forgotten what it meant to rest. When she finally sat opposite him, he sensed that the fire was not only warming them, it was revealing them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The crackling flame filled the hollow with a soft rhythm that echoed faintly against the ice, creating a sound like distant breathing. The traveler felt the heat seep into his bones and loosen the tight grip of fear that had hardened inside him over weeks of walking alone. He watched her silently adjust her boots, brush frost from her sleeves, and tighten the braided cord at her waist. Everything she did seemed purposeful, as if she wasted no gesture, no thought. He wondered if she had been born in this frozen world, or if she had chosen it because both possibilities felt equally impossible. She finally lifted her gaze, and he felt its weight like the first touch of warm hands on frozen skin. It was not threatening, not invasive, but ancient, informed by years of listening to things he had never learned to hear. When she spoke, her voice was low, steady, and shaped by the cadence of distant coasts and drifting ice. "You walked too far," she said, not as accusation but as fact, as if she had watched his entire journey from somewhere high above the tundra. He swallowed, unsure how to respond. The storm had pushed him off the marked trail days ago. He had been wandering without direction, hoping the land would show mercy. She studied him with narrowed eyes, then added, "You carry the look of someone who lost warmth long before the snow took it." He didn't understand how she knew, but something in her certainty stripped his defenses. He nodded faintly, admitting more with that movement than he had spoken aloud since his father's burial. She accepted the answer with quiet acknowledgement, as if grief were a language she understood fluently. The fire grew brighter, reflecting in the smooth walls around them. He noticed the small details of her face, not softness, exactly, but strength shaped by wind and endurance, a kind of beauty forged by necessity rather than ornament. Her hair, streaked with frost, hung in braided strands that brushed her shoulders, and her eyes held a depth that reminded him of frozen lakes, clear on the surface, unfathomable beneath. She lifted a hand and held it near the flame, not to warm herself, but to test the temperature, measuring how much of the heat he needed more than she did. The humility of the gesture unsettled him. He had expected harshness, suspicion, anything but this subtle care wrapped in silence. For the first time since he had stepped into the storm, he felt something fragile pull at him, a feeling almost like safety. When she finally leaned forward, the fire outlining her profile in amber light, she studied him for a long, unbroken moment. Then, without ceremony, without warning, in a voice that sounded both weary and decisive, she said the words that froze him more deeply than the cold ever had. "Give me a son." He stared at her, breath suspended, unsure if he had misheard, because the request was impossible, startling, and delivered with the same calm certainty one might use to ask someone to pass salt across a table. But her eyes told him she meant every syllable. She was not pleading, she was not bargaining. She was declaring something shaped by necessity, by lineage, by a weight he could not yet understand. He felt the earth tilt beneath him, the fire crackle louder, the air grow still as if the ice itself were listening. Before he could speak, before he could even inhale, she continued, her expression unreadable but her voice carrying a quiet ache. "Not now," she said. "Not today, but someday." A promise, not an act. She watched the confusion in his eyes settle into something deeper. "You do not understand yet," she added, "but you will." The flames flickered against her face, illuminating the faint scar that crossed the bridge of her nose, a mark that spoke of battles he could only imagine. "The land is changing," she whispered. "My people are fading. I cannot guard the ice alone." And in that moment, he felt the truth of her request like a weight placed gently into his hands, too heavy to lift, too sacred to drop. The traveler sat frozen, the warmth of the fire warring with the chill spreading through his chest. He did not know her name, her village, her purpose. But something in her voice carried a kind of inevitability, a feeling that his life had already begun to shift in the direction of her words long before he met her. He lowered his gaze, trying to steady his breathing, but the hollow felt suddenly too small, the fate she had spoken too large. She did not push him for an answer. She simply watched him, waiting, as patient as the ice that shaped her. The traveler did not answer her immediately, nor did she expect him to. Her request lingered in the air between them like a slow-forming frost, collecting weight as it settled into the hollow silence. He watched the fire ripple across the curved walls of ice, the reflections bending and flexing like a living thing, creating a strange sensation that they were sitting inside a heartbeat rather than a shelter. He felt the pulse of his own confusion, the raw trembling of a man who had already lost too much and feared losing even the illusions he had left. She sat opposite him, calm and unwavering, her posture straight despite the fatigue that must have lived in her muscles after days or weeks out in the tundra. Her stillness compelled him to breathe slower, to think not with panic but with the deeper part of himself that rarely spoke. And when he finally lifted his gaze, he realized she was studying him with the patience of someone who had spent her life waiting for storms to pass rather than trying to outrun them. The storm outside weakened further, its howling reduced to distant murmurs that pressed faintly against the alcove walls. He listened to the softened wind and realized how much harsher the world out there felt compared to the quiet presence inside the hollow, her presence. She had not stated her name, nor asked for his, as though such details belonged to another world, one that didn't matter beneath the horizon of ice stretching in every direction. She reached down and began lightly carving a straight line into the snow with her thumb, the motion absent-minded yet purposeful, as though she were drawing a border around a truth she had carried for years. Her movements were steady, contemplative, and the simplicity of the action made him acutely aware of how tightly his own hands were clenched. He forced himself to loosen them. The skin on his knuckles pulled painfully, reminding him of every cold night he had endured alone, every prayer whispered into the wind that took his words and offered nothing back. Her eyes lifted from the snow and settled on him again, this time with a softer, more searching weight. "You think my request is a burden," she said quietly, and he felt the truth of it echo through his chest. He did think that. How could he not? He was a man traveling through grief, a man without direction, carrying more questions than strength. He feared promising anything to anyone, feared being relied upon, feared being needed in a way he was not sure he could fulfill. But she seemed to see past that. She seemed to see the man beneath the exhaustion, beneath the doubt, beneath the ache. He had not yet spoken a single word to her, and still she read him as though his silence were a book written in the language of the wind. She leaned slightly closer to the fire, allowing its warmth to trace the lines of her face, revealing both her youth and the ancient heaviness that lived behind her calm exterior. "It is not a burden," she added, "but a path." He swallowed, unsure whether the tightness in his throat came from fear or the unexpected trembling of being seen. He had grown used to invisibility after his father's death, drifting through small harbors and snow-covered towns where people spoke in hushed voices but rarely looked him in the eyes. Yet here, in a hollow of ice lit by a single flame, a woman who lived in a world beyond roads and maps looked at him as if she recognized something worth calling forward. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words refused to form, lost beneath the heaviness of her request. She seemed to understand, letting silence return between them. It was not uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that gave him time to breathe, to understand the depth of what she had asked. And as he watched her place another piece of moss into the fire, he felt a quiet shift inside himself, a loosening of something he had kept locked away. She finally spoke again, her voice slow and steady. "A guardian cannot stand alone," she said. The traveler frowned slightly, not out of disbelief, but out of the desire to understand what she meant without stepping into the forbidden realms of myth or superstition. She wasn't talking about spirits or prophecies, he sensed that. Her words were grounded, rooted in reality, shaped by the survival of her people and the demands of the land. "The ice is changing," she continued, as if she were recounting observations carved from years of watching the thaw and freeze cycles grow unpredictable. "The wind no longer speaks the way it did, the seals wander differently. The frozen sea breaks earlier." She paused, searching his face to ensure he understood. "A guardian protects not the spirits, but the living, the land, the children who will walk it." And in that moment, he realized she was not requesting a son for herself, but for her lineage, for her people, for the continuity of a responsibility she had not chosen but accepted. He felt something tighten inside his chest, a slow compression that forced him to exhale through his nose. She wasn't asking him to give her himself. She was asking him to give the future a chance to survive. That understanding created a deep, aching conflict in him, because the part of him that had grown numb after losing his father resisted the idea of building anything new. Another part buried deep beneath layers of cold and despair reacted differently. It stirred, like embers discovering a single breath of oxygen. The traveler lowered his head and rubbed his hands together near the flame, feeling the returning sensation in his fingertips, the fragile promise of life beneath the skin. She watched him without pressing, without urgency, giving him space to weigh the unspoken consequences of her request. The hollow felt warmer now, but not only because of the fire. It felt warm because her words had opened something inside him that he hadn't realized was still alive. The ice guardian shifted slightly, letting her back rest against the curved wall of the alcove. Her expression softened, and for the first time, he glimpsed vulnerability behind the layers of strength that defined her presence. It was fleeting, subtle, like the delicate cracking of thin ice in spring. "My mother carried this role alone," she said, her eyes focusing on the fire rather than on him, "and her mother before her. Each of them stood through winters harsher than this one, winters that buried villages, winters that erased entire paths between families." She inhaled slowly. "I did not think I would be the last." The traveler watched the muscles of her jaw tighten slightly, the only sign that her composure was built on discipline rather than lack of feeling. She let out a long breath, the kind that carried years of unspoken fear, and he felt the hollow grow more intimate not because of what she asked, but because of what she admitted. The traveler found himself leaning forward, drawn not by obligation but by a growing respect for the weight she carried. He had lost a father, a single person who anchored his world. But she had inherited the responsibility for an entire landscape, for the hunters, the families, the children who depended on knowledge passed from one guardian to the next. She had spent her life learning to read the ice, to understand the patterns of shifting pressure beneath frozen surfaces, to sense the slightest change in the cold that could determine whether a hunt would fill bellies or leave them empty. She had taken on a role meant for multiple generations, knowing she could become the end of a lineage that had lasted longer than memory. He felt a tremor in his chest, something like empathy but heavier, more complete. It made him understand that her request, strange as it sounded, was born not of desire but of desperation layered beneath dignity. When their eyes met again, his breath caught not out of fear, but from the undeniable truth that she was offering him something in return for the promise she sought. Not love, not romance, not any bond he wasn't ready to give. She offered him purpose, a direction, a place where his steps mattered. The firelight flickered across her features, revealing the faint curve of exhaustion at the corners of her eyes. She had carried this burden for too long, and though she stood strong, she was still human beneath the frost. The traveler felt his throat tighten with the urge to speak, to say something that acknowledged the impossibility of her request and the quiet honor embedded in it. But the words came too slowly, trapped beneath layers of uncertainty and fear that had built themselves into walls around his heart since his father's passing. He took a long breath, letting the cold air sting the back of his throat, and finally managed to speak, not an answer, not a promise, but a question. "Why me?" he whispered. The moment the words left his lips, he almost regretted them, afraid they sounded childish, unworthy of the gravity of her request. But she did not react with disappointment or amusement. Instead, she regarded him with a depth that made him feel both exposed and understood. "Because you carry grief with strength," she said. "Because you walk even when you do not know where you are going. Because you still warm your hands by the fire instead of surrendering to the cold." Each sentence felt like a gentle blow to his chest, reshaping the way he saw himself through the clarity of her perception. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes reflecting the flame. "You do not know your strength yet, but I do." Her words settled into him with a weight that was not oppressive but grounding, like the first solid step after walking on unstable ice. He stared at the fire, letting the crackling fill the space where his thoughts tangled too tightly to articulate. She seemed content to let him absorb everything, her patience steady and almost comforting. Outside the alcove, the storm had shifted into a light flurry, the snow falling softly enough that the sound of each flake landing could almost be heard. The world felt muted, wrapped in the hush that follows the release of great tension. He let the quiet settle over him, until his breathing matched the slow rhythm of the flame, until the fear inside him loosened into something more manageable. When he finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, he felt different, still uncertain, still overwhelmed, but no longer frozen by the magnitude of what she had asked. The fire had burned low by the time the traveler gathered the courage to meet the guardian's steady gaze again, and in the dim orange glow he finally understood that she was not waiting for an answer born of impulse or panic. She was waiting for the truth, whatever shape it took, and truth in the Arctic was slower than thawing ice. He drew a breath through his nose, feeling the heavy scent of singed moss and melting frost inside the hollow. The air tasted like survival, like the first meal after days of hunger, like something the world offered only when it believed a person had earned it. She remained still, her knees bent, her hands resting lightly atop her thighs, her breath steady and almost too quiet for him to hear. The flame flickered between them like a fragile bridge, illuminating the subtle tension in her shoulders, the outline of strength that made him feel both protected and small. And as he watched her, he realized that despite her request, despite her composure, she was bracing herself for the possibility that he would refuse. The thought unsettled him more deeply than he expected. He had been a stranger to her world only hours ago, a wandering man nearly swallowed by the storm, and yet the prospect of disappointing her, this woman who met the cold with grace and the wind with stillness, felt unbearably heavy. He lowered his gaze to his hands, admiring the faint color returning to his fingers, and wondered how someone like her had carried such a burden alone. The grief he bore was personal, intimate, tied to the memory of a father who taught him how to mend nets and read the sea currents. Her grief, though hidden beneath discipline, radiated outward, tied not to one man but to generations, to an entire landscape that relied on her. He sensed that she had asked him not out of weakness, but out of a rare moment of openness, an opening she might never offer again if he squandered it. The responsibility in that realization pressed against his chest like a new kind of cold, one that chilled not the skin but the conscience. The guardian finally turned her face from the fire, her gaze shifting toward the entrance of the alcove, where the dim light of the stormless sky glowed pale blue. She studied it for several seconds, observing the patterns of blowing snow as if deciphering something layered within the wind. Her silence was not avoidance, it was information gathering, the same way a hunter listened to the ice for signs of thinning or pressure shifts. He watched the shape of her profile against the glowing wall, the firm line of her jaw, the faint twitch of concentration near her temple. When she exhaled, the sound was so soft that he barely registered it, yet it carried an entire world of understanding. "You are afraid," she said, not turning toward him. The words held no criticism. They were an acknowledgement, a recognition of something she had felt long before he let it show. Fear is not weakness. Fear means you know what it costs to promise something that lives beyond you. The traveler felt the truth of that sink into him with quiet weight. He had walked across frozen plains with fear as his only companion, but this was different. The fear she spoke of was not the fear of dying. It was the fear of living with purpose again, of holding something fragile and meaningful and being responsible for its survival. He lifted his gaze and studied the lines of her back, the way she anchored her boots into the snow, the way she carried herself like someone who would sooner break than bend but who still bent when survival demanded it. "I don't know who I am anymore," he murmured, surprised that the words escaped his mouth at all. They fell into the air with an honesty he had not intended to share, an honesty sharpened by exhaustion and softened by her presence. She turned slowly toward him, her expression unreadable but undeniably attentive, and he felt seen in a way he had not since childhood. "When a person is lost," she said, "the snow shows only the steps they have taken, not the ones they will take." She let the words rest between them, allowing their quiet wisdom to settle like falling flakes. "You think you must know everything before you move. But the land does not wait for certainty." She leaned slightly closer to the fire, allowing its glow to warm the planes of her face, and he felt an unexpected surge of calm rise through him. "A guardian does not seek someone perfect," she added. "She seeks someone who listens. Someone who moves toward warmth even when the cold begs him to stop." Her eyes drifted across his features as though searching for a spark he had long forgotten. "I asked you for a promise because I saw a man who keeps walking even when his heart is broken. That is more strength than most men ever carry." He took a deep breath, and the fire seemed to respond, lifting its flame as if encouraged by the air he released. Her words formed a trembling sensation inside his chest, disrupting the numbness that had been his only shield since his loss. He did not know what future she envisioned, nor what role he was truly meant to play, but he sensed that refusing out of fear would carve a regret deeper than any scar. The weight of her request was heavy, yes, but the shame of stepping away from it felt heavier still. He rubbed his hands together absent-mindedly, watching the trail of warmth the friction created, and a strange question formed inside him whether he was meant to find her, or whether the land had led him to her because both of them carried a loneliness too great to bear alone. The thought was unsettling and comforting at once, a contradiction he could not fully understand. The wind outside shifted suddenly, pressing a faint but sharper whisper against the ice, and she straightened immediately, her posture narrowing into alertness. She listened with an intensity that made him realize how attuned she was to the world beyond the alcove, how each sound carried meaning he could not decipher. After a long moment, she relaxed again, though her expression remained thoughtful. "The land is restless," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "It changes faster than it should." Her jaw tightened, and he saw a flicker of something else beneath her composure, not fear, not exactly, but urgency. She turned to him, the firelight catching in her eyes like reflections of distant stars buried beneath frozen lakes. "You ask why I chose you," she continued. "There are many reasons, but one matters most. The land moved to place you in my path. You may not believe it, but I have learned to trust what the cold breaks and what it spares." He felt a tremor beneath his ribs, a mixture of awe and humility rising like a tide he could not hold back. He clenched his jaw, struggling to gather his thoughts, and finally found the courage to ask, "What happens if I say no?" She inhaled slowly, as if preparing herself. The air around them seemed to pause. "Then nothing changes," she said, though her tone revealed the weight behind the words. "I continue alone. The ice becomes one more burden I carry until I can no longer stand against it." She lifted her chin slightly, not in pride but in acceptance. "And the next storm will take what remains of my strength." Her voice did not break, yet something in it fractured as subtly as thin ice under shifting wind. He felt his breath catch, struck by the quiet bravery of her resignation. She was not manipulating him. She had simply told the truth, and the truth was bleak. The traveler pressed his palm against the snow-covered ground beside him, grounding himself in the cold firmness. The ice felt almost reassuring, a reminder that even the harshest landscapes held structure, purpose, and quiet beauty. He thought of his father, of the nights they spent by the sea mending nets and sharing warmth, while storms howled outside their small cabin. His father had once told him that a man's purpose was not always chosen. It sometimes arrived uninvited, disguised as burden, only to reveal itself as the thing that saved him. As he stared into the fire and felt its heat seep into his chest, he wondered whether this moment, this woman, this frozen land, this impossible request was the purpose he had been stumbling toward without knowing it. He lifted his gaze and found her watching him again, her expression unreadable but patient. She did not lean forward, did not push, did not demand. She simply waited, as if the entire white world outside could hold still until he found the words he needed. His throat tightened, his chest ached. And then, with a breath that felt like stepping through the first crack of long-frozen ice, he whispered, "I don't know if I can be what you need." Her eyes softened not with pity, but with quiet understanding. "You do not need to be anything yet," she replied. "Just stay until the storm returns. Let the land decide the next step." The simplicity of her request lifted a weight inside him he hadn't realized he was carrying. He nodded slowly, and she accepted the gesture with the faintest dip of her head, as though the first piece of a much larger promise had been placed gently between them. The agreement to stay until the storm returned sounded simple when it left his lips, but as the hours unfolded, the traveler realized that time moved differently in the realm of the Ice Guardian. The hollow became less of a temporary shelter and more of a suspended moment carved out of the world, a pocket of stillness where the usual measures of days and nights dissolved into cycles of light and shadow across the ice. He did not sleep at first, not fully. Instead, he drifted in and out of a heavy, drifting awareness, his eyes half closed, watching the Guardian's silhouette as she tended the fire, adjusted the airflow through a narrow opening, and listened to the shifting language of the wind. The snow outside fell in fine, nearly weightless flakes that clung to the entrance, casting delicate patterns of light into the hollow. Within that fragile calm, he felt his body slowly releasing its tension, as though it finally believed it was allowed to inhabit the space without needing to run. The Guardian's movements remained economical and precise, but as the hours passed, he saw the small traces of fatigue around her eyes. The way her shoulders rolled slightly when she thought he wasn't watching, easing muscles that had been hardened by endless days on the ice. She spoke little, yet each word she chose carried weight. When she shifted, he heard the faint creak of worn leather and the whisper of her fur-lined coat brushing the snow. She broke dried fish into small strips and handed him half without ceremony, her fingers brushing his gloved hand briefly. The contact was fleeting but carried a strange warmth, as if she had shared more than just food. He chewed slowly, the salty flesh filling his mouth with life, and realized he hadn't eaten anything meaningful in days. The act of accepting sustenance felt strangely intimate, like stepping further into a space that was not only physical, but deeply human. At some point, when the sky outside dimmed into a soft, blue-gray twilight, she finally asked his name. The question came without prelude, spoken gently across the glow of the fire as if she were testing whether he would anchor himself here with something as simple and irrevocable as a word. He hesitated, not because he had forgotten it, but because he had grown unused to hearing it spoken aloud since his father's death. "Daniel," he answered at last, the syllables feeling foreign and heavy, as though they belonged to a man he had not yet re-met. She repeated it once, quietly, letting the sound sit on her tongue. In her accent, it softened, the vowels shifting slightly, reshaping his sense of who he was. "Daniel," she said again, as if committing the name to memory, tying it to the fire, the hollow, and the quiet agreement that held him there. When he asked for her name in return, she paused for a heartbeat longer than he expected, as though weighing whether offering it would alter something fundamental in the balance between them. "Alea," she said finally. The name carried a low music shaped by wind and old stories, a sound that belonged to the sea ice and distant shorelines. He repeated it under his breath, feeling the weight of it settle inside him. Alea did not react outwardly, but he saw a faint relaxation in her shoulders, a tiny uncoiling of a tension she had carried since meeting him. Names had power here, he realized, not mystical power, but the grounded power of recognition, of being accountable to another person in a land where anonymity could swallow a man whole. They were no longer nameless figures passing through each other's lives. They had become Daniel and Alea, sharing firelight while the tundra watched. As the hours lengthened, the hollow filled with small fragments of their histories, revealed not in long confessions but in precise details offered like stones laid into a careful circle. Daniel spoke of the harbor where he had grown up, where boats rocked against worn wooden piers and gulls shrieked at dawn. He described his father's hands scarred, rough, smelling of salt and rope guiding his own as they mended nets under lantern light. He told her about the winter his father's heart had failed him in the middle of a storm, not out at sea but in their small home, his breath stolen quietly while the wind screamed outside. Alea listened without interrupting, her eyes fixed on the fire, her posture attentive, absorbing each word as if it were a piece of a larger map she was carefully drawing in her mind. She did not offer platitudes or hollow comfort. She honored his grief by allowing it to exist, and edited, in the space between them. When she finally shared pieces of her own past, she did so with the same clarity and economy that defined all her movements. Her mother had been guardian before her, though Alea said the word without self-importance. It sounded more like guide or keeper in her language, someone who understood where the ice was safe and where it would swallow those who trusted it too easily. Her mother had taken her onto the ice when she was still a child, teaching her to listen for the low trembling beneath their feet, to read the colors in the snow, to recognize the difference between a crack that warned and one that invited. Her father had been a hunter, quiet and patient, who once told her that the ice remembered every step ever taken across it. The day he did not return from a hunt, her mother had stood alone at the shoreline, eyes fixed on the horizon, and Alea understood without being told that her life would now be shaped by watching the place where the frozen sea met the sky. Her story was not embellished with drama or sudden twists. It unfolded as naturally as the slow drift of snow across a field, carrying the weight of years in each measured sentence. She spoke of villages that had moved inland as the ice became less predictable, of elders who shook their heads at the way winters changed, no longer consistent, no longer loyal. She recounted the first time her mother had fallen through thin ice, how the water's grip had nearly taken her, and how they both had learned afterwards that knowledge alone could not steady a world that refused to stay still. When her mother grew older, the responsibility shifted quietly to Alea. There was no ceremony, no proclamation. One day, people began asking her for guidance instead. Where to hunt, which path to avoid, when to travel and when to stay. The title guardian had settled over her like snow, soft, silent, and impossibly heavy. Listening to her, Daniel felt a strange mixture of empathy and awe. He had always viewed the cold as an enemy to be endured until spring, something that gnawed relentlessly at exposed skin and stole breath from tired lungs. For Alea, the cold was an old, demanding teacher. It could be cruel, but it rewarded those who listened well. She did not romanticize it, nor did she resent it. She simply accepted that the land gave and took with the same hand, and someone had to stand in the narrow space between those actions, warning others before the ice claimed what it could not return. When she fell silent, the hollow felt fuller, as if her words had drawn invisible ancestors into the space, their presence lingering in the softened echo of her voice. Daniel shifted, feeling his chest ache with the realization that her burden was not merely about survival, but about memory, about carrying forward a way of understanding the world that could easily disappear. It was later, when the light outside deepened into a darker blue and the fire's glow became the primary source of warmth and sight, that the meaning of her earlier request returned to the center of his thoughts. "Give me a son." The words no longer sounded like a demand carved from stone, but like a plea woven from lineage and fear. He realized now that she did not imagine a child as a symbol or an ornament or a possession. She imagined him as continuity, a bridge between her elders and a future where someone still knew how to read the ice, where someone still understood that the land's warnings were sacred even without being supernatural. The child she spoke of would not exist to satisfy her loneliness, but to prevent the loneliness of an entire land forgotten by those who no longer listened. That truth humbled him, widening the space inside his chest where his answer might one day live. Daniel found himself watching her more closely now, seeing not only strength but the subtle cracks along its surface, the nights she had likely spent out on the ice alone, listening to the distant groan of shifting floes, wondering if anyone would come after her when she grew too tired to stand. He imagined her younger, following her mother's footsteps, alert and eager, believing there would always be another guardian after her. Somewhere along the way, that certainty had fractured. Now she sat across from him, carved by wind and duty into someone whose eyes rarely rested on herself and instead tracked the horizon, the sky, the sound of distant ice. To be asked to share in that burden felt frightening, but to turn away from it felt even more so. Because with every passing hour, he sensed that this hollow was not simply protecting him from a storm outside. It was giving him space to decide what kind of man he would be when he stepped back onto the snow. When exhaustion finally began to pull his eyelids downward, Alea spoke softly, as if addressing both his body and the part of his spirit that remained on guard. "Sleep," she said. "The cold will wait." Her certainty felt like a blanket more tangible than the furs he pulled around his shoulders. He hesitated for a moment, reluctant to surrender the fragile connection forming between them, but his body betrayed him with a long, shuddering exhale. He lay down on the compact snow, feeling its firmness beneath the thin layer of furs, the fire's warmth brushing his face in light pulses. As his consciousness began to drift, he saw her silhouette one last time seated, watchful, her gaze angled toward the entrance, listening to the land on his behalf. It struck him then that she had spent most of her life keeping vigil alone. The thought settled into him like a stone in a quiet lake. He slept without dreams for the first time since his father died. No crashing waves. No heavy silence at the bedside where he had begged for one more breath. No echo of the priest's voice reciting words that bounced off the ceiling and fell flat onto an empty floor. Instead, he floated in a deep, enveloping stillness that felt neither warm nor cold, just calm. When he woke, the fire was smaller but still alive, and a faint gray light seeped through the ice near the entrance. Alea was there, not where he had last seen her, but standing just inside the mouth of the hollow, her figure framed by the gentle swirl of snow outside. She turned when she sensed his movement, as if his waking were as audible to her as a shift in the wind. There was a slight curve at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but something close, something that hinted at a quiet relief. He realized with a start that she had been listening all night to both the land and his breathing, making sure neither one betrayed him. When he pushed himself upright and wrapped his coat tighter, he felt different, not transformed, not suddenly certain, but steadier. His grief was still there, anchored deep within him, but it no longer felt like an anchor dragging him down. It felt like weight he could carry rather than drown beneath. Alea watched him with the same calm attention as before, but there was a new softness in her eyes, a recognition that the man who had gone to sleep beside her fire was not exactly the same as the one who had awoken. She stepped closer, the snow beneath her boots compacting with each movement, and for a moment he thought she might repeat her request. Instead, she said something far simpler, but somehow heavier. "Today, you walk with me." Daniel walked beside Alea across the endless white, learning to read the ice as if it were a new language. She showed him how the wind carved paths, how deep blue meant safety, and how perfect white often hid danger. Each step with her returned a piece of himself he thought the storm had taken forever. For the first time since his father's death, he felt he belonged somewhere not by obligation, but by choice. At the ridge overlooking the fractured lake, Alea finally spoke the truth beneath her silence. She wasn't asking him for a child now, nor for an immediate promise only that he return after the next storm. That he walk with her again, learn what the land tried to teach, and not abandon what had begun to awaken inside him. Daniel realized it wasn't a burden but an invitation to purpose. He accepted it with a quiet, steady "I will." As he left her, the snowfall thickening behind him, Daniel felt an unexpected peace settle in his chest. Alea watched him until he became a small figure in the rising storm, her presence a steady point in the shifting world. And as he walked, he carried not certainty, but direction, something warm and patient glowing quietly within him.